Rick Stroud of the Tampa Bay Times here on the Rich Eisen Show. How are you, Rick?
Hey, Rich, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
What in the world happened?
Well, Rich, the Glazers are sort of famous for dragging their feet on these decisions. They didn't fire John Gruden until January 17th. So, they met with Lovie Smith. They talked about what they thought the deficiencies were. In particular, Lovie Smith hired a couple coordinators that didn't work out in Jeff Tedford and Leslie Frazier. He took over the defensive play calling. The defense did not get better. He brought in a lot of his former Bears players or guys that had played in the Tampa too. They weren't really much of an improvement. And going forward, I think the Glazers just didn't feel like his plans with respect to the staff, not that they asked him to make any changes, but he wasn't really prepared to do so. I think they just felt like, at the end of the day that he was not going to move the team forward. And, Rich, I think another factor is simply that they like Dirk Cutter. Dirk Cutter is getting a lot of attention from the Miami Dolphins and other teams, and they like him with their rookie quarterback. They'd like to keep some continuity there, so he now becomes, I think, probably the prime candidate to replace Lovie Smith.
Rick Stroud joining me here at the Tampa Bay Times. So are you saying the fact that Lovie got the right guy for Jameis Winston when that was such a first-round overall selection draft choice fraught with so many issues, that Lovie got the primary issue, nailed it, by getting the right guy in Dirk Cutter and surrounding him with whomever needed to be surrounded to get the kid on the straight and narrow, that essentially wound up costing him the job because the defense wasn't keeping up its end of the bargain? Is that essentially what you're saying?
Rich, that's really it, and it sounds, the way you put it, it sounds awful, and I guess it is for Lovie Smith, who, by the way, was fired over the phone.
Is that right? That is true.
If you can believe that. But, I think, first of all, Lovie made the decision to take Jameis Winston, which was a very polarizing decision, even in Tampa at the time. They have a special relationship. I think you have to credit him with as much success as you do Dirk Cutter for what Jameis has done. But, and hiring Dirk Cutter, and Dirk having success, the offense was fifth overall in yards, but it was only in the 20s in points scored. But they won 6 games, and yet, a month ago they're 6-6, and in the playoff hunt, when you lose your last 4, that's sort of happened around here. These coaches end up getting fired. So 8-24, the second worst record over the last 2 years. All of that figured in, and it wound up. You're exactly right. It wound up actually hurting Lovie Smith.
But I also mentioned at the top of the show, Rick, that Ron Rivera went 14-22 over his first 36 games, and that's not that much better than 8-24. Carolina stuck with him. Look where he's gone with his first overall selected quarterback. Is there no patience in the Glazer family to see how this was playing out at all, Rick?
Rich, I don't think so. I mean, the bottom line is this has become the Cleveland Browns of the NFC. I mean, this will be their 5th head coach in 9 years, their 3rd in 4 years. When you make this many changes, the lack of continuity winds up hurting your football team. Lovie Smith made a 75% change on his roster just within, the last 2 years. So that is something that winds up hurting you. And I can't explain it. I've had people say that, well, they're passionate about winning, but if you're a Bucs fan, how much faith do you really have in the Glazers getting it right the next time? And I know it's difficult. Jason Light was brought in here really for the most part by Lovie Smith. Now he winds up essentially having to fire him and then go out and try to hire the next head coach. But it's a great question. I don't know what has happened to the patience in the NFL, but I know in having lived it here, it's done nothing but set this football team, back each time.
So what happens now? Because, there has to be a Rooney Rule candidate brought in. You can't just fire, say, somebody like Lovie Smith and hire Dirk Cutter, just turn right around, even though that may be their plan. And if that happens, can't Cutter go ahead and interview in other places, or they can hold on to him while interviewing other candidates for their job and refuse to let Cutter to interview other places? Because it's possible or is it possible that Cutter, while they have to go through the process of hiring somebody, goes somewhere else anyway, Rick?
Well, it's possible, and they cannot prevent him from interviewing for a head coaching job unless they actually offer him their job and he accepts. And you're right, they have to go through the process with the Rooney Rule. They're going to do that. Now, my understanding is that they will actually interview other candidates as well. I don't know who those would be at this point. I know that, obviously Jason Light and John Robinson have a history in New England, so you think about Josh McDaniel and some people like that. There's plenty of candidates out there that are going through multiple teams. But, in the interim, you'd have to think, Dan, that they've talked at some level to Dirk Cutter, and that before you would make this decision, maybe not all their eggs are in Dirk Cutter's basket, but let's face it, I mean, if you're looking at Lovie Smith and you're looking at continuity or the lack of continuity on offense, and you think Dirk Cutter, and they've said that he's a prime candidate, then you have to think that they'd want to move quickly and keep him, from accepting a job someplace else, and at least to talk to him about that. But my information is that those two things they tried to keep separate. They tried to make a decision on Lovie Smith, and then they'll evaluate Dirk Cutter when he interviews.
So, Tampa Bay Times, Rick Stroud joining me here. A couple more questions left then. Did Lovie Smith think he was coaching for his job in December?
I don't believe he did. I mean, I sat down with the Glazers last year, and the whole edict was, hey, we got our franchise quarterback. Let's make progress. Let's see the arrow going up. And, despite losing the last 4 games, I don't know how you could think that you're going to do a whole lot better than 6-10, with a rookie quarterback. I mean, Jameis Winston, and for that matter, Dirk Cutter's offense did not play well the last 4 weeks of the season. They scored 2 touchdowns in the final 4 games in the first half, and one of those was after a blocked punt. So, the third down was terrible. The red zone was bad. So it's not as if, this was one thing. And, oh, by the way, they've only drafted, they've only drafted, Rich, one defensive player in the last 2 years, Quan Alexander. So when you put that many resources on offense, of course your offense is going to get better, but the defense hasn't had a chance to really replenish itself with young players. That's why they were using so many free agents.
Well, lastly for you, Rick, is that we know what some defensive players thought about this. We know Levante David and his deleted tweets. Gerald McCoy's been quoted as well as being shocked by this. Any idea how this has landed with Jameis Winston at all?
I don't know. I will say that Jameis was very close to Lovie Smith, and I would never underestimate the coach-quarterback relationship. I think, Dirk Cutter deserves and gets a lot of credit for developing Jameis. I think Jameis is an extraordinary talent. But I think that relationship, an African-American quarterback and African-American coach, was special. And I haven't talked to him. We haven't had a chance to talk to him. But I think he would be upset about it initially. The only saving grace would be if they do retain Dirk Cutter. That's also a very close relationship, and he respects him as well. So it's not going to be easy when you start changing head coaches on these guys. And we've seen it now, both in Tennessee and now in Tampa Bay.
Rick, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks for calling into the show.
Thanks for having me, Rich. Appreciate it.
That's Rick Stroud of the Tampa Bay Times.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern. On Audience.